Resolute Square.
There was also maintained what was called an enemies list, which is rather extensive and continually being updated.
Democrats want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
I'm Rick Wilson, and this is The Enemies List.
Hi, folks. It's Rick Wilson, and welcome back to The Enemies List. My guest today is Barbara Walter. Barbara is the author of How Civil Wars Start, a subject that Americans haven't had to think about for, 160 plus years. But here we are again, thinking about, from time to time, how civil wars start. So I'm so glad that Barbara joined us today, because she's going to walk us through how they start, how they occur, and a little bit about what factors exist in America right now that could lead to something like that, and what factors would mitigate against it. So, Barbara, welcome to The Enemies List. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So let's start out. I mean, that's the big question. How do civil wars really start? What is it that causes a civil war, especially in and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, especially in a more developed, more first world country?
So we actually know a lot about this question, and I'll give you a little bit of background so that your listeners know that there's legitimacy here, there's data here, and I'm not just making this stuff up. That's
my job.
There are hundreds of data sets. There's at least 5 big organizations that collect data on everything having to do with factors that create risks of civil war. I wrote this book after being on a task force that the U.S. government has. It's run by the CIA. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. Most people have never heard about it, but they actually have a Wikipedia page. You can read about them. It's been around since 1994. I joined the task force from 2017 to the end of 2021. And the goal of the task force, or one of the goals, was to come up with a model that would help our government, the U.S. government, predict what countries around the world were likely to become politically unstable, were likely to experience regime change, or were likely to experience civil war. When the task force was comprised of 2 types of people, experts on civil war like myself, academics, and then the other half of the task force were data analysts. And when the data analysts put together the model, they asked the experts, they said, tell us everything that could possibly matter in the outbreak of civil war. Anything that in any of the studies that have been done, ever came up even potentially significant. And we gave them 38 different factors. So we gave them a lot of things that we thought might matter. And some of those factors seemed kind of obvious at the time, like whether a country was poor, whether it had lots of minority groups, whether those minority groups were heavily oppressed. And we gave those factors to the data analysts. They went away, they worked on their model, and they came back and they said, it turns out only 2 factors were really important. And they were not the 2 factors that the experts thought would matter. So we were surprised. They were surprised. The 2 factors were, the first one was something called anocracy. And anocracy is just a fancy term for a partial democracy. It's a government that's neither fully democratic, it's not fully autocratic, it's something in between. So it might be a country, for example, that has elections, but those elections aren't entirely free and fair. Or they might have elections that are free and fair, but only one party is ever allowed to compete. So that party keeps staying in power over and over again. That's an anocracy. It turns out that countries that are full democracies, countries that are full autocracies, rarely experience civil wars. The civil wars happen in this middle zone. The second factor, and then I'll hand it back over to you, Rick. But this is so important for people to know, because we know this. The second factor was whether citizens in those anocracies organize themselves politically. So their political parties were organized not around ideology, whether you were conservative or liberal or communist or capitalist, but they were organized predominantly around identity. Whether you were Black or white, Muslim or Christian, Croat or Serb, Hutu or Tutsi, you see the pattern. If a country had those two factors, the task force considered it at high risk of political instability and political violence, and we put it on a watch list. We actually called it the watch list, and we sent that watch list to the White House.
Well, having heard that, I got to say, I can't imagine we're not on the watch list at this point.
No, absolutely. So this is the CIA is not allowed to study the United States. We never talked about the United States. It was never mentioned legally. It's verboten. And that is absolutely the way it should be. But we can extrapolate from the data. We can look at our own country and we can see, do we qualify or do we not?
Well, I mean, look, I've written a lot about this myself. The Republican Party is post-ideological. It is based on cultural identity at this point. And this sense of shared outrage and this sense of shared cultural oppression that they believe they suffer from. And to our Democratic friends, a lot of their party is based on identity too, around a certain cluster of socially progressive ideals and ideations that they have about that. But those two factors, the partial democracy question, I mean, we were almost a partial democracy. There were certainly people fighting to break our democracy in the 2020 election and after. And so I guess we still I guess we can still cling to that one as a stability point for right now. But one of the things that I'm always fascinated by is, and I've done some studying on the the Rwandan conflict, and that idea where violence becomes a politically, it has that weird like Overton window motion of it's okay to discuss it, it's okay to occasionally deploy it, it's okay to deploy it, it's okay that it's a part of our political process. Are you seeing that in the U.S. as well? Because I mean, I certainly feel like not just 1/6, but beyond that, there's a sense of rising engagement with the idea that political violence is acceptable.
Yes, you are seeing that. And there's two additional patterns that are important for people to know about. The first is that we know who tends to start civil wars. And again, it's not the people and the groups that most people would expect. People think it's going to be the poorest groups in society. They expect it's going to be the groups that are most heavily discriminated against and oppressed. They think it's going to be the immigrants who are sort of struggling to survive. Those people generally don't rebel. And they don't rebel because they don't have the capacity to rebel. Those groups are generally unhappy. They don't like the status quo. They would like the status quo to change, but they have no ability to change it because they've been marginalized and because they are oppressed and because the government and those in power are watching them and making sure that they can't rise up. The groups that tend to rebel, and you look at this, it's across countries and continents and across decades. We see this again and again. And this is especially in ethnically based civil wars. The groups that tend to rebel are the groups that had once been politically dominant and are in decline. They have the grievances. They're angry at their loss of status. They're resentful that other groups are rising up to compete with them, that maybe some other groups are doing better than them. They're angry at changing demographics that will slowly make them less politically able to compete. And they have the capacity. Still are in positions of power. They have the ability to organize. Oftentimes, people aren't paying attention to them, or they are actually working behind the scenes surreptitiously and creating smoke screens for people to distract people from their attempt to maintain power using whatever means possible.
That's so the stolen election rhetoric might fall into that category.
Well, that would be the non-violent way to hold on to power.
Sure.
Usually they try that, right? Nobody wants to go to violence first. Violence is a last-ditch effort. You're going to try to use all sorts of, nasty, dirty tricks to stay in power. You'll use legal means to manipulate the system to your benefit. And then you'll sort of slowly concentrate power in your hands. And if you can get away with it like Viktor Orban did in Hungary, you can get everything you want that way. But if democracy holds and you have to continue to compete in elections, especially in winner-take-all majoritarian systems like we have here,
Sure.
If the democracy holds and you have to continue to compete, and demographics are against you, and that, for example, in 2045, your group is unlikely to be the majority anymore, then you can look down the road and you can anticipate that at some point you will not win elections if you continue to represent only that particular ethnic group. And those are the groups that eventually lose. They have no more strategies left. And then they turn to violence.
I've often wondered about that because there's a certain inchoate underpinning to a lot of the anger among white male boomers who have become very much angry at immigration, very much angry about the country becoming more demographically diverse, very much angry. It's been a long through line from the civil rights movement almost to today of people who've felt and who've been messaged to very effectively by some very smart people that those people have come and taken your job, taken your place in society, and I wonder if we're kind of racing on the one hand, an actuarial table that's going to hopefully flush a lot of that stuff out of the system, and a moment of political crisis where so many of them are so angry, and they see this decade, for instance, as the big battleground on whether they maintain. Because look, folks, America, 50% of the children born in this country are not white right now. They are mixed race, or they're Hispanic, or they're Asian, or they're African American. And chances are, as my friend Stuart Stevens says, they're not changing race anytime soon. So I kind of wonder if you see that as a demo in our country that presents a sort of unique risk right now.
Absolutely. But let me put an even broader perspective. The United States is not the only country that's going through this transition. We are the first white majority country that's going to transition to non-white majority, but all the others will eventually follow. Canada is going to be next, probably followed by Australia, New Zealand, the UK eventually, and probably eventually the rest of white majority European countries, because climate change is going to also be a factor. That's going to create mass migration from the global south. They're going to go where they can walk, and they're going to go to places that are wealthy and democratic. And so Western Europe is going to have this problem on the same phenomenon they're going to have to face down the line. The United States is the first to go through with it, which is why we have to get it right, because we have to show the rest of the world how you transition peacefully from a white majority democracy to a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, and still maintain unity and strength and all the other good stuff that goes with that.
Well, it's always been funny to me because that is the fundamental issue of America. We were the propositional nation. We were the nation that wasn't about blood and soil. We were the nation that, when my immigrant German ancestors came here in the 1820s, they were the scum. And then the Irish came and they were the scum. And the Italians came and they were the scum. And the Vietnamese, and on and on and on. So, and we always, it always just became, by the second or third generation, you were always like washed into the system. You became an American. It's propositional. You're born here, you're raised here, you adopt the culture values. And the funny thing is this profound insistence by a lot of like I said, the white male boomer types, that people from other countries are genetically or culturally impossible to assimilate. And I think you're right. I think that really is the big test for the world. If we can show the assimilation works, and we've done it, folks, we've done it for 200 plus years. We're pretty good at it. Then I think it's an example for the rest of the world that it's not Camp of the Saints or this like fear porn on the far right about immigration. But I do want to go back to the question of how much of political polarization do you see as a risk factor in a civil war, especially in this country, because we are increasingly less a country with a big broad middle and more a country with two hyper-polarized, hyper-vigilant political orientations, not even just parties, but orientations.
Yeah. Political polarization is not associated with political violence. You can be highly ideologically polarized, and those people don't tend to turn violent on each other. And the United States has had periods of time when we've been highly ideologically divided, and we didn't go to war. There's a big difference between what we call ethnic factionalism, when society begins to break down into these tribes and they start to engage in winner take all politics. And they start to talk about the other side as, not human, as the enemy, as they're vermin, or there's all sorts of these
insects vermin,
or cockroaches is what the Hutus called the Tutsis.
The Tutsis, yeah.
And it's that specific situation. If the Republican Party was still truly the party of conservative values, and the Democratic Party was a party truly of liberal values, they could be very, very far apart, and we would have a much deeper sense of calm. Like, okay, we can handle this. We disagree about a whole series of issues, taxation, this and that and that. But we aren't at the point where we hate each other, and we there's a subset of us that believes the other side doesn't deserve to live. That's what's different.
I think that's right. It's certainly not a majority of either party yet, but I feel like there are louder voices so far, especially as the legal pressure has increased on Donald Trump in the last few months. Louder voices on the right that have said things like, if you put him in jail, it's a civil war. You won't like what happens to this country. I mean, and I know the Civil War was this in our nation. The Civil War was this unbelievably wrenching, profound, powerful, multi-generational trauma that lasted. I mean, you could argue we're still playing out the Civil War today in a lot of ways. The idea of America slipping into another one would always be predicated by the increase of violence. Am I right on that? I mean, it seems like democracy declines, you reach a tipping point, and then it's like, screw it, I can't win at the ballot box, I'm going to go shoot that guy.
Yeah. And let me just say, like, what precipitated the first Civil War, the American Civil War, was Lincoln's election. And it wasn't just that Lincoln was elected, that was the first election in U.S. history that the president won without any help from the South. Prior to that, the South controlled who the president was, and as long as they could control the outcome of the election, they knew that the wealthy landowners could continue to have slaves and continue to have this exploitative economic system that benefited them. And the South at the time was not a full democracy. It was at best a partial democracy that then controlled the politics of the rest of the United States. The election of Lincoln was just absolutely heart-wrenching for them, and it signaled to them that demographically they could no longer win. And if they could no longer win, they could not prevent the growing anti-slavery movement from eventually eliminating slavery, and so they declared independence. So it was this devastating loss that signaled that the power structure had radically changed.
And I think what surprised the South also, I mean, look, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which destroys the Whig Party. It was not just that Lincoln won without support from the South, but he won with a brand new party that was oriented towards maximizing the rights of individuals across the country, including those who at the time were held in chattel slavery. And I think that, and that to me is an echo of today, where there are these two profoundly separated cultures in this country. And I think in a lot of ways, you would not have had a Donald Trump emerge if you'd not had a Barack Obama elected president.
Yes. If you look at the data, if you look at the data at the growth of militias, the growth of hate crimes, the growth of the of the far right, there is a sudden and very pronounced uptick starting in 2008. And it was because America elected an African-American president.
It's funny because when we I was a Republican back then. We fought hard against Barack Obama in the election. And when John McCain came out at the end and graciously said, he's our president now, I wish him well, there was a schism inside the party that was so pronounced and so profound that, I mean, it started me on my weird journey to wherever the hell I am these days, because there were two things at that time that I saw that like cultural shift had broken the old GOP. One was the reaction to McCain doing that, and to McCain saying, no, he's not a Muslim. He's a good man. He's not a crazy socialist sleeper agent. And the second was, I was one of the first Republicans to come out of the box and say, hey, this birth certificate stuff is stupid. Stop it. And I had people with no evidence at all. They're like, oh, no, he must be. He had to have been born in Kenya. It has to be a lie. We'd never elect a black guy. And the shock of that strikes me as this, like, again, as this catalyzing moment where Trump's rise and the rise of a sort of anti-democratic, small d democratic movement was almost inevitable.
Yeah. Well, and again, you see this in other places. Bolsonaro in Brazil. Brazil just recently went from being majority white to majority non-white. And Bolsonaro won his election, his first election, because he, like Trump, realized that if he played on the fears of especially wealthy white men in Brazil, who normally wouldn't vote for somebody like him, that he could get their vote. And that's how he catapulted himself into power. Modi is doing something similar in India by preying on the fears of the Muslim minority. And Duterte in the Philippines, you can go around the world, you're seeing this. And we have actually a name for people like that. We call them, political scientists call them ethnic entrepreneurs. Donald Trump is a classic ethnic entrepreneur. He understands, there's a brilliance to Donald Trump in terms of his instincts for understanding what resonates with people. And it's oftentimes what resonates with people that he taps into is the basis instincts of fear, of anger, of resentment. And what they do is they recognize, ethnic entrepreneurs recognize that there's something about identity that does mobilize people, that then when people feel insecure and when they're afraid, they will gravitate towards their own race or their own religion, and they will gravitate towards individuals who then tell them they can protect them or make things better for them. And so even if the ethnic entrepreneurs don't actually believe the stuff that they're saying, they understand that it will bring them support. It will bring them revenue. Rupert Murdoch is an ethnic entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
Talk radio, on AM radio.
Rush Limbaugh was an ethnic entrepreneur for a generation.
Evangelical, ministers who are looking to grow their congregation and to increase their revenue. They use ethnicity and identity to do that. So and there are these moments in time when for whatever reason there's rapid technological change, or there's rapid demographic change, or there's an economic crisis. People suddenly feel nervous, and ethnic entrepreneurs take advantage of these times to like grab people's attention, bring them under their own tent, and then use it for their own self-interested goals. And that could be building an audience or getting into the White House.
Right. And that, do you find those universally in civil wars, or ethnic or social change entrepreneurs like that? Are they a common factor, a common through line in a lot of these places where, because you outline, and the number, folks, is shocking. It's over 250 civil wars since World War II. That's a real number. That's a lot of, this is not something that's like a random isolated event that pokes around in history, like the U.S. Civil War, the Russian Civil War. It's much more common. Do you find that sort of character at play in these things, not only the racial entrepreneurs, but sort of the change entrepreneurs?
Nobody has looked at change entrepreneurs. They've only looked at those that use religion, ethnicity, and race.
Okay.
So all we know from the data, although I suspect that if you were to look more generally at the leaders of these movements, that they would be doing the same thing. But we can say that in ethnic, religious, and racial wars, you almost always have these entrepreneurs. And I'll give you an example. And everybody remembers, or most people will remember, the Rwanda genocide. The Rwanda genocide happened when a peace treaty was signed between the existing government of Hutus and the Tutsis who were rebelling and were months away from basically winning that war and taking control of the capital. Right. 3 months before that happened, the existing government said, hold on, we'll negotiate, we'll share power. And they drew up a very detailed agreement, a compromise. And it was between the moderates on the Tutsi side, the moderates on the Hutu side. The losers in this was this group of extremist Hutus who really held the big power in government. And the peace and who were the troublemakers, and the peace agreement basically said, you're out. Right.
And who controlled the radio stations?
And they controlled all the radio stations. and what they did is they basically spent the next 18 months trying to figure out, okay, how can we prevent this new government from forming? And they concocted this crazy strategy of genocide, which also is more common than most people know. And they're like, well, the Hutus are the majority group in Rwanda. The Tutsis are the minority. If we can convince average Hutus that Tutsis are coming in, they're going to take control of the government, and then they're going to kill all the Hutus. If we can convince them that they and their families are in danger, and the only way they're going to prevent themselves from being killed is if they picked up a machete and killed the Tutsis before they were able to do it to them, then this crazy sort of Hail Mary strategy could potentially work. And they took it to the radio stations, and it was a constant 24-hour stream of the cockroaches. They're coming to kill you. You got to do, we must take action.
Rape and kill your women, all that. Yep.
It's the same, it's kind of the same narrative that you hear again and again in slightly different forms.
Mexicans are flooding over the border to take your job and kill your dog. There'll be taco trucks on every corner.
Rape your women, your wife and your kids.
Women.
Yeah.
That line from from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the war, where they had one of the radio hosts from Rwanda, and he said, "I knew I was pouring petrol all over the countryside. I just didn't know when someone would strike the match." And that's the sort of thing I think we have. There are a lot of social media and broadcasting entrepreneurs in this country who are doing their very best, and Rupert Murdoch at the very peak of the pyramid, honestly, to sort of at least have the predicates all out there, pouring a lot of petrol into the countryside. So let me ask you this most important question: how do you stop a civil war from starting? How do you prevent one from starting? And how do you stop one once it's running? Aside from having to go through like our Civil War, where we lost, roughly 650,000 Americans, military and civilian, in a horrifying and terrible half decade. Yeah.
Well, again, you go back to the data. If civil wars happen in countries with a weak democracy and with these highly racially, ethnically, religiously divided parties, then if you strengthen your democracy, if your parties reach across ethnic and racial lines, the risk of civil war goes down a lot. Full, healthy democracies do not experience civil war. The United States is no longer a full and healthy democracy. So I was just about to say the easiest thing to do, but this is not easy because we haven't been able to do it yet, is we need to reform America's democracy. We have, as you know, we have an odd, unusual, unique democracy that nobody should try to copy America's democracy. It's the result of a whole series of compromises that needed to be made mostly with Southern states. It includes a whole series of very undemocratic features that make us particularly vulnerable to democratic backsliding. We know what those undemocratic features are. We know that they make us vulnerable to a weak democracy. Things like the filibuster, things like the disproportionate representation in the Senate, things like big money in politics. We can go on and on and on. These are things that are that democracies that are really healthy. Think about Denmark or Switzerland. These are things those democracies do not have. They don't have their own parties, run elections. They have an independent election commission so that people trust the outcomes of elections. The problem is that President Biden knows all of this. When he was elected, the Democrats had control of all the main branches of government. This was the best chance they had to reform our system, and they didn't have the votes to do it. So if they don't have the votes to do it, and the Republican Party has no incentive to reform the system because all of those undemocratic features tend to disproportionately benefit rural red states, then reform isn't going to happen, which means we're going to be sitting here with this vulnerable democracy for quite some time. The second thing,
unless we lose our vulnerable democracy,
unless we lose, that's a whole other a topic of discussion. The Republican Party at some point, and actually, I'd be interested in what you have to say about this, Rick, has to broaden its tent. They've been saying this now for over 10 years. We have to reach out to Latinos. We have to reach out to a wider swath of the American population. They have not been able to do this. When do you think this will happen? It's got to happen at some point.
It's interesting because we worked on that for a generation inside the Republican Party. And look, George Herbert Walker Bush, who I worked for, got it. He talked about it. Even back in 1988, we have to do better with Hispanic voters. And so they went to work on it. His son got 37% of Hispanic voters. Now, that number dropped off precipitously as time went by, and it's getting lower and lower. But as long as you have a party that is dedicated as one of its main message platforms to saying that immigrants to this country are culturally and politically and genetically incompatible with America, then you're going to keep losing those people. Now, they've made some small inroads here and there with certain groups like Venezuelans who are particularly in the anti-socialist message, and with certain small sections of Hispanic men. But It's a long-term problem that is a real time bomb underneath the Republican Party, because in 25 years, the average American voter is a lot more likely to be a Hispanic male than he is right now by a factor of about 3 or 4. So people in the Republican Party who are in the Trump space, they're caught in this bind where they have to stick with the anti-immigration message, but they empirically understand it. They intellectually understand it, but they're also then confronted with the angry white dude who used to work in an auto factory and now moved to Florida and he's retired and he's pissed off, who says, I don't want those people in my town. So it's a tough bind. Now, to give the Democrats some tough love, though, that's not a tough bind that solves your problems right now. And you better start talking to those people, because as those second generation or first and second generation Hispanics become more culturally American, they're going to be much more likely to reflect their economic incentives and imperatives than the traditional ethnic incentives and imperatives. It's a narrow path for the Democrats to walk on that, but it's a really high, steep one for the Republicans, if that makes any sense.
I'll shift just quickly. I think actually, both of those things are hard to do, as we just discussed. Yeah. They're long-term things. We don't necessarily have decades, of time.
No.
The single easiest thing that I think that we could do to reduce the risk of violence is to regulate social media. Period.
Right.
And when I say regulate social media, I don't mean regulate the content. Let people put whatever they want on social media. Right. Regulate the algorithms, because right now we know we have increasing evidence that the algorithms are designed to push out the most extreme, the information that's extreme, that's incendiary, that taps into people's the reptilian brain about fear and anger. And the 5 biggest tech companies are all American companies. They're all here in the United States. And at this point, they're basically completely unregulated. No other industry that has been shown to have a whole host of negative societal effects remains unregulated. And again, to get back to these undemocratic features of our system, the fact that money, is a means to influence and is a means to prevent legislation, if it's not in your benefit, means that they're getting away with causing a whole series of problems, from depression to suicide to violence, and nothing's being done about it yet.
DC is filled with very, very highly compensated lobbyists for Meta and for Google and for Apple and for Twitter and everyone else. TikTok has right now, if you're a lobbyist in DC and you want work, TikTok will hire literally guys behind the bus station. Anybody who needs a job in DC working for TikTok can get a lobbying gig. But you're exactly right. And you know what? I think this is one of the unanticipated factors. This may have to become eventually one of the metrics here, is how much of an impact does social media play in that algorithmically selected conflict, chaos, and hate that civil wars sort of rely on for fuel? And how effective are bad actors at manipulating those algorithms and manipulating that data and manipulating that audience to drive them into doing things that are profoundly and cataclysmically destructive for democracies.
No, I mean, the irony is that the tech companies, their goal is not to destabilize society. Their goal is not to increase, depression amongst teenage girls. That's not their goal. Their goal is profit, right? And in order to get profit, they need engagement. So their goal is to maximize engagement, to keep people on their devices as long as possible. But the secondary effect of that, of people's, of wanting people to stay on their phones, is you're feeding them material that is much more negative than I guess that I don't want to say the average. It's disproportionately negative.
No, and you're right. The algorithmic incentives on all social media platforms, chaos drives engagement.
Yes.
Anger drives engagement. Loathing drives engagement. Fear drives engagement. It's not just people doing
butterflies and unicorns do not drive engagement.
Right. If I say something awful about Donald Trump on Twitter, as I did on Thursday, I get 50,000 likes on a post.
Yeah.
If I say something like, look at my cute cat, I will get 200. There is a true algorithmic incentive. And there are a lot of negative incentives in our politics these days, but the social media stuff is truly a rocket fuel for that. Well, Barbara, I want to thank you so very much. Folks, I really, really recommend that you go out and wherever fine books are sold, and get Barbara's book, How Civil Wars Start, available at Amazon and all the other places that books are sold. It is a fascinating read, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them by Barbara Walter. And I think you will find this something very valuable, especially right now in the strange moment that we are in America. Once again, Barbara, thank you so very much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Where can people find you on social media, by the way?
I'm on Twitter or whatever it's called today, BF Walter, at BF Walter.
BF Walter, at BF Walter. Great. Well, Barbara, thank you again so very much. And we will talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Rick, for having me.
Hey, today on the enemies list are the bitch-ass people who are hating on the U.S. women's soccer team. Now, I'm going to be honest with you folks. I don't watch soccer. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about when it comes to football or soccer. Okay. God bless you. I basically follow fox hunting, polo, and college football. I don't follow soccer. But the unbelievable nastiness of people on the right in the last couple of days, celebrating the fact that the American women's team lost, in this bullshit attack on their wokeness, get the hell out of here. You guys are the most small-hearted, small-minded, shitty people I can imagine. And normally I'd like to put people on blast who are doing really terrible political things that are corroding the fabric of this country, but you kind of are. You know what? If you celebrate an American team that's competing overseas, it ought to be universal, whether it's guys or women, whether you like their politics or not. You know what? They're the best soccer players in the world when it comes to women's soccer. They got beat. It happens in sports. But your graciousness could go a long way to proving to people that you're not deserving residents of the enemies list. Thanks again for listening to the enemies list. If you have any comments, questions, or if there's someone you'd like to hear on the podcast, hit me up on Twitter at @TheRickWilson. Thanks again for the wonderful support you've shown the pod. We're growing fast. It really helps if you will share this with your friends, your family, and anyone else who, like us, is trying to save democracy. While you're at it, if you could rate and review the podcast, I would be very much appreciative. I know this is the sort of thing you've heard a billion times. Please rate, review, like, blah, blah, blah. But you need to do it. It really does help us a lot. We are slaves to the algorithm, my friends. And if you do this, it will help get the pod out further. Anyway, thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time. And remember, whatever you do, stay off the list.